The story of Bernard Lawrence Madoff did not begin in a dark alley or a boiler room. It began on the sunny shores of Rockaway Beach in Queens, New York. In the late 1950s, a young Bernie worked as a lifeguard and installed sprinkler systems to save up $5,000. With that modest seed money, he founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities in 1960. While other young men on Wall Street were focused on shouting orders on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, Madoff looked toward the future, technology. Madoff was a pioneer of electronic trading. At a time when stock prices were still written on chalkboards and communicated via ticker tape, he pushed for the automation of quotes. His firm was one of the first to use computers to execute trades, a move that bypassed the traditional human specialists and made trading faster and cheaper. This innovation was so successful that Madoff eventually became one of the primary architects of the NASDAQ stock market. He didn't just play the game, he built the stadium. By the 1980s and 90s, Madoff was a titan of the industry. He served as the chairman of the NASDAQ Board of Directors and was a trusted advisor to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, on how to regulate the very markets he helped create. He was the statesman of Wall Street, charming, soft-spoken, and seemingly possessed of an almost supernatural integrity. To the public and his peers, Bernie Madoff was a self-made genius who had modernized American finance. This aura of immense respectability provided the perfect velvet curtain for what was happening behind the scenes. While his legitimate market-making business on the 19th floor of the Lipstick Building in Manhattan was busy processing thousands of real trades, Madoff was quietly building a separate, secretive investment advisory wing on the 17th floor. He was the guy you wanted to be. He was the guy you wanted to manage your money because he was the smartest man in the room. Former Madoff investor. Madoff's secret weapon wasn't a complex algorithm. It was his reputation. He began managing money for a tight-knit circle of wealthy friends at the Hillcrest Country Club and Jewish charities. He promised and delivered steady, consistent returns of 10% to 12% annually. It didn't matter if the market crashed or surged. The Madoff statements always showed a profit. This split-strike conversion strategy, as he called it, seemed like financial alchemy. In this first chapter of his empire, Madoff wasn't just a broker, he was a god. People didn't just invest with him, they felt privileged to be allowed into his inner circle. He had successfully cultivated a myth of infallibility that made questioning him seem like an act of blasphemy. The legend of Bernie Madoff was born out of genuine innovation, but it was being fueled by a growing, hidden hunger that would eventually consume $65 billion and thousands of lives. As the 1990s transitioned into the early 2000s, Bernie Madoff's investment advisory business became the most exclusive club in the financial world. He didn't use flashy television ads or aggressive cold callers. Instead, he utilized the most powerful marketing tool known to man: exclusivity. Madoff mastered the velvet rope strategy. He made it difficult for people to give him their money. If you asked to invest, he might turn you down, claiming his fund was closed or that you didn't meet his unspoken standards. This manufactured scarcity created a feeding frenzy among the global elite. The allure of Madoff was not get-rich-quick volatility, but never lose consistency. While the dot-com bubble burst and markets swung wildly, Madoff's statements arrived every month like clockwork, showing steady gains of roughly 1% per month. He claimed to use a split-strike conversion strategy, buying blue-chip stocks and hedging them with options to limit downside risk. In reality, the strategy was much simpler. He wasn't buying anything at all. He was simply depositing new investors' money into a massive Chase Manhattan bank account and using it to pay out returns to older investors. To fuel this growing monster, Madoff relied on a network of feeder funds. These were independent hedge funds and private banks, such as Fairfield Greenwich Group and Tremont Capital, that did the dirty work of gathering billions from investors in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. They funneled the cash to Madoff in exchange for massive fees. These professional money managers failed to perform even basic due diligence, blinded by Madoff's stature as a former NASDAQ chairman. They assumed that if the legendary Bernie Madoff was handling the money, it had to be safe. Madoff's social circle was his primary hunting ground. He targeted the Jewish Borscht Belt elite, from the country clubs of Palm Beach to the charity galas of Manhattan. He wasn't just their broker. He was their friend, their confidant, and their safe harbor. High-profile figures like Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, Hollywood director Steven Spielberg, and legendary pitcher Sandy Koufax saw their foundations and personal fortunes tied to Madoff's supposed genius. It was the ultimate betrayal. He sat at our tables, he hugged our children, and all the while, he was planning our financial execution. A former friend and victim. The psychological brilliance of Madoff's scam lay in its boringness. By promising moderate, steady returns rather than astronomical 50% gains, he avoided the typical red flags of a Ponzi scheme. He cultivated an air of quiet wealth that suggested he had found a secret mathematical formula for stability. He even discouraged his investors from talking about him, telling them that if too many people knew his strategy, it would stop working. Beneath the surface of the velvet rope, however, the math was beginning to fail. As the billions poured in, the amount needed to maintain the returns grew exponentially. Madoff was riding a tiger he could no longer control. He was no longer a financier. He was a hostage to his own lies, desperately waiting for a miracle, while the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building worked overtime to print the fiction that kept the world believing in the Wizard of Wall Street. To the outside world, the Lipstick Building at 885 3rd Avenue was a symbol of corporate elegance. On the 19th floor, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities operated a legitimate high-tech market-making business, where Bernie's sons, Mark and Andrew, oversaw real trades. But the true heart of the empire beat on the 17th floor, a restricted, windowless space that Mark and Andrew were forbidden from entering. This was the engine room of the fraud, a place where time seemed to stand still, and the 21st century's digital revolution was intentionally ignored. While the 19th floor hummed with the latest servers, the 17th floor relied on outdated IBM AS 400 computers from the 1980s. Madoff insisted on using old technology because it was easier to manipulate and harder for modern auditors to track. Here, a small group of hand-picked, non-financial employees, many with no formal training, spent their days backdating trades. They would look at historical stock prices and cherry-pick the best-performing days, then manually type up thousands of fake trade confirmations and monthly statements to match Madoff's promised 1% monthly gain. The operation was a masterpiece of bureaucratic theater. To pass SEC inspections, Madoff's team created a paper trail so massive and detailed that it discouraged deep digging. When regulators asked for documentation, Madoff would bury them in thousands of pages of fabricated logs. He famously charmed examiners, name-dropping his connections at the SEC and making them feel like amateurs for questioning a founding father of the NASDAQ. Between 1992 and 2008, the SEC investigated Madoff 5 times and failed to find the fraud every single time. However, not everyone was fooled. In 1999, a quantitative analyst named Harry Markopolos looked at Madoff's performance chart, a line that went up at a 4-5-degree angle with almost no dips for a decade, and realized it was mathematically impossible. Markopolos sent a detailed 19-page memo to the SEC titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." He proved that there weren't enough options traded in the entire world to support Madoff's claimed strategy. Madoff is a Ponzi scheme. The math doesn't work. It's a legal impossibility. Harry Markopolos. In a 2005 letter to the SEC ignored him. Madoff was too big, too respected, and too connected to be a crook. He used this untouchable status to silence internal dissent. On the 17th floor, he fostered a cult-like loyalty among his staff, paying them exorbitant salaries to keep the printers running. He kept the accounting firm for his multi-billion-dollar fund limited to Freeling and Horowitz, a tiny, 3-person outfit operating out of a storefront in a New York suburb. One was a secretary, one was retired, and the third was Madoff's rubber stamp. By the mid-2000s, the Lipstick Building was a house of cards built on a foundation of fake paper. Madoff was now managing over $60 billion in assets, but the Chase Manhattan bank account that held the actual cash was dwindling. He needed hundreds of millions in new investments every month just to pay out the investors who wanted to withdraw. He was a wizard who had successfully hidden a mountain of debt behind a curtain of green screen computers and charming smiles, but the global economy was about to experience a seismic shift. that no amount of fake paper could hide. The miracle of Bernie Madoff's fund was built on a single, fragile assumption that the world would never stop giving him money. But in September 2008, the global financial system suffered a heart attack. The collapse of Lehman Brothers sent a shockwave of terror through every boardroom and country club in the world. Investors who had once treated their Madoff accounts as rainy day funds suddenly needed that cash to cover losses elsewhere. The velvet rope was torn down as a stampede of investors rushed for the exit. Madoff had spent decades juggling billions, but by December 2008, the math had finally run out. He needed to pay out $7 billion in redemptions. But the Chase Manhattan account, the actual source of all his wealth, held only a few hundred million. He was cornered. In a desperate final act of generosity, he decided to distribute the remaining $170 million as early bonuses to his inner circle and family members. This erratic behavior tipped off his sons, Mark and Andrew, who demanded to know why their father was throwing money away while the firm was supposedly struggling with liquidity. On the evening of the 10th of December 2008, in his luxury penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side, the wizard finally dropped the curtain. Bernie sat his sons down and confessed the truth that had been hidden in the windowless room on the 17th floor for decades. He didn't use technical jargon or excuses. He simply said, "It's all one big lie." He admitted that the investment advisory business was finished, that he was broke, and that he had been running a giant Ponzi scheme for as long as anyone could remember. Horrified and fearing they would be implicated in the greatest crime in history, Mark and Andrew did what their father never expected. They contacted their lawyer, who called the authorities. The next morning, December 11, FBI agents arrived at Madoff's door. When they asked if there was an innocent explanation for his son's claims, Bernie calmly replied, "There is no innocent explanation." The news of Madoff's arrest hit the financial world like a nuclear blast. Within hours, the lists of victims began to leak, and the scale of the devastation was incomprehensible. It wasn't just wealthy socialites. It was the Fairfield Greenwich Group, losing $7.5 billion. It was Santander, losing $3 billion. It was the Elie Wiesel Foundation, losing nearly every penny it had for humanitarian work. Entire life savings, retirement funds, and charitable endowments vanished into the digital ether of the 17th floor's IBM computers. As the winter of 2008 deepened, the image of Bernie Madoff shifted from a visionary to a monster. He had stolen more than just money. He had stolen the safety of the global Jewish community and the trust of an entire generation of investors. The wizard was now a prisoner, and as the investigation peeled back the layers of the lipstick building, the world realized that the $65 billion figure wasn't just a number. It was a ledger of tens of thousands of ruined lives. The fall of Bernie Madoff was not just a financial collapse. It was a human tragedy of biblical proportions. As the wizard sat in a prison cell, the world began to count the cost of his $65 billion lie. The numbers were staggering, but the faces behind them were even more haunting. Thousands of retirees who had trusted Madoff with their life savings suddenly found themselves penniless, forced to sell their homes or return to work in their 70s and 80s. Charitable organizations, from the Lapin Foundation to Yeshiva University, saw their endowments vanish overnight, halting decades of humanitarian work. In June 2009, Madoff appeared in a Manhattan federal court, dressed in a somber suit. He pleaded guilty to 11 felony counts, including securities fraud, money laundering, and perjury. He offered a hollow apology, claiming he was deeply sorry and ashamed, but the victims in the gallery met his words with cold silence. Judge Denny Chin was unmoved, labeling Madoff's crimes extraordinarily evil and a staggering fraud. He sentenced Madoff to 150 years in prison, the maximum allowed by law, effectively ensuring that the 1-year-old would die behind bars. The destruction, however, did not stop at the prison gates. Madoff's own family became the final victims of his deceit. His sons, Mark and Andrew, who had turned their father in, were hounded by the public and buried under a mountain of lawsuits. The shame and the relentless legal battles took a lethal toll. On the 11th of December 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest, Mark Madoff committed suicide in his Manhattan apartment. 4 years later, Andrew Madoff died of mantle cell lymphoma, blaming the stress of the scandal for the return of his cancer. Ruth Madoff, Bernie's wife of over 50 years, was stripped of nearly all her assets and lived a life of seclusion, a pariah in the world she once ruled. Bernie Madoff spent his final years at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. He became an object of morbid curiosity for other inmates, reportedly running a small-scale monopoly on the prison's hot chocolate supply, a final, pathetic echo of his market-making days. He died on the 14th of April 2021, at the age of 82. There was no grand funeral, no tributes from Wall Street, and no one came to claim his ashes. Yet, from the ashes of his empire came a massive effort for justice. The Madoff Victim Fund, led by trustee Irving Picard, launched a relentless global hunt for the lost billions. Through thousands of lawsuits against feeder funds, banks, and big winners who had withdrawn money before the crash, they managed a feat many thought impossible. By 2023, they had recovered over $14.5 billion, nearly 91% of the actual principal lost by victims. It remains the most successful recovery of stolen assets in history. The legacy of Bernie Madoff is a permanent scar on the face of capitalism. His crime forced a total overhaul of the SEC, which had ignored a decade of red flags. It led to stricter auditing rules and a global skepticism toward consistent returns that seemed too good to be true. Today, the name Madoff is synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of trust. He remains a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators don't always wear masks. Sometimes, they wear bespoke suits, sit in the most prestigious boardrooms, and smile while they steal your future.